This is a Global Original Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Christmas 2021 edition of the Best of the Ian Dale Book Club. This is where we look back on a year of podcasts and try and pick some of the highlights, and there have been quite a lot. So if your favourite isn't included in this selection, I do apologise, but we've got some absolute crackers for you to enjoy over the festive period. Let's start with three excerpts from three podcasts from the beginning of the year. First of all, Peter Dixon, who may be a name that you don't know, but you'll all know his voice because he was the voice of the X Factor and Britain's Got Talent. And he's been around in the world of entertainment for several decades. And to say this podcast was anecdote-tastic would be not an exaggeration. Then we are going to listen to Simon Heffer talking about the Chips Channon diaries, or the first volume of those diaries. The second volume was released a couple of months ago, and I'm going to be interviewing him about that early in the new year. And then I talked to Hella Pick, who is a veteran correspondent for The Guardian, about her memoir, which is absolutely fascinating, talking about her time in Germany and then on the Kinder transport and her first years in the UK. So that's our first selection for you. You literally did start at the bottom, didn't you?
The bottom of the heap, yes. I was about to go to university, and as I was choosing my university, one of the universities on the list was Queen's University in Belfast, a very, very great university, in fact, and one of the Ivy League universities now. And I went to the Freshers' Day and met a few people. It was the pre-Freshers' Day, when you're choosing a university, and they had all the various societies there. And one of these societies was the Film Society. Now, there wasn't a radio society, there was a film society. So I was quite interested in film and photography. So I spoke to this guy, and he said, come along on Tuesday night, and we're having a meeting. And I went along to that meeting and got involved. And to cut a long story short, one of the guys who was helping us out in the Film Society, we made little 16mm films. He made a documentary about something. I've even forgotten what it was about now. But he said, I'm looking for someone to narrate it. Would you like to have a go at narrating it for me? Because I'd been doing a bit of home recording myself on a very, very basic Panasonic cassette recorder, can you imagine? So I did this documentary for him, and he said that went really well, he said. And then about a few weeks later, he said, they're looking for somebody to do some part-time announcing work at the BBC in Belfast. I think you should apply. I thought he was mad, but I did apply. And a week later, I got this phone call after I'd come home from school, because I was still at school at this point. And the head of the presentation department at the BBC in Northern Ireland said, can you come and start on Monday? I said, yeah, but absolutely. I put the phone down and I thought, what the hell have I just done? And my mother drove me up there on the Monday, and he gave me an audition, and I got the job of part-time news reading work, announcing work, and it was the most fantastic experience in those days. I was only 18 as well.
Well, exactly, and an 18-year-old's voice is very different from somebody sort of over the age of 50. I mean, what was your voice like then? Did you yourself understand the power of your voice at that point?
I don't think my voice had any power at that point. That's the point.
It must have had something.
I must have had something. But when I listen back to fairly old recordings of myself, and not that long ago, I mean, even the 80s, I sound so different, as we all do. I mean, imagine, Ian, if you listen to recordings of your show from back in the day, you'd cringe, as I do when I listen to myself.
Well, I've only been doing it for 10 years, so...
Well, even 10 years you'll have changed.
But I remember the Louise Burt, who was deputy head at LBC for some time, she said that she wanted me to liven up my voice a bit, because I do have a bit of a soporific voice. And she would literally, before a programme started, she would scream through the window, "Big bollocks!" Which I'd quite like to hear you say, actually.
Yeah, okay. Let's have a go. Do you think it'll make a difference? Ian Dale's Big Bollocks!
I'm going to clip that. I'm going to clip that up and send it to her.
Clip it up. Oh, that made me laugh.
But did you do an RP accent then, even when you were 18, or was it?
Yes, I think so. I think I had this idea that if you were on the BBC, you had to speak with an RP accent. So I deliberately, I think, knocked a lot of the Ulster sort of vowel sounds out of my delivery, and I had this horrible kind of clipped, fake, sort of Scots-Irish kind of voice, which was terribly, terribly like this. You know, this is the BBC, and of course nowadays that sounds so awful and wrong. And so I think over time, you know, the zeitgeist moves forwards, things change, tastes move on. And this is part of the reason, I think, why some people get left behind in media, because they don't change or they don't have the ear to hear what's going on. So it's important for us for me as a voice actor and other people in media to pay attention to how things are and listen to popular culture, listen to a wide range of radio shows, listen to watch movies, and do all that, absorb popular culture as much as you can, because only if you do that will you then unconsciously or sometimes consciously you will move forward with the way things are going, and you will remain current. So that's one of the challenges that we all face as actors and voice actors, that we have to remain current at all times, otherwise you do get left behind. And you know, the last thing you want to be is to end up as the guy in the pub complaining about how the world has changed and things ain't what they used to be. Of course.
Hang on, that's most of my listeners.
You need to grow a pair, Ian, really. So I think it's fascinating. I mean, I think it is really fascinating how tastes change over time, and sometimes imperceptibly you don't even notice it.
Now, you then moved to Radio 2 as a newsreader and announcer, and you ended up presenting a sort of comedy-based show, Peter Dixon's Nightcap.
Yes.
I mean, I don't remember that, but
No,
I didn't really listen to Radio 2 much in those days. I suppose I was a Radio 1 listener. But the way you describe it in the book, I mean, it sounds an absolute riot, and the sort of thing that actually would go down quite well now.
I think so. It was a curious little show. It went out on a Friday night between 11 and 1, I think it was, or 10 and midnight. I can't even remember this. It was late anyway. And it was one of those shows I think was way ahead of its time, and not many people heard about it or listened to it. But those that did, and I still have people today tell me how they enjoyed it, listening to it. In fact, just yesterday on Twitter, somebody said, I remember you from Nightcap.
Certainly by the end of this volume, any reader will have the impression that Chips is pretty interested in men, emotionally at least, and probably more so than women. But he meets Peter Coates very early on in Volume 2, which, as I say, is coming out in September. And it's then that he becomes more and more exclusively, I think, homosexual rather than even bisexual or heterosexual. I don't think he was ever properly heterosexual. I think he is bisexual in this volume, but doesn't really talk about it. And obviously people didn't in those days, even in a close society like this. I mean, by the 1950s, when you've got Maxwell Fyfe as Home Secretary, and he's ordered the Metropolitan Police to go and scour every public lavatory in London to round up every homosexual they can find in there. And it's almost like a persecution that goes on in 1953, 54. Even then, high society, where people know that others have got quite close homosexual relationships, they don't talk about it because they know it can get people into trouble. And Chips is immensely discreet in this volume. He's less discreet in subsequent volumes, but it's quite clear by Volume 2 that he's a man who's interested in men.
And there was quite a lot of it about in politics in those days. Chris Bryant's book, The Glamour Boys, I mean, kind of shows what, certainly during the pre-war and war years, there were quite a lot of Conservative MPs in particular who were that way inclined, but we only know about it now.
Well, that's true. I don't know Chris Bryant. I've read and enjoyed, to an extent, some of his books. I wish he'd let me know he was writing this, because I'd have told him to hold on for another couple of years. I think that he'll find a lot in the first two volumes, in particular, of these diaries, and possibly a third volume, that won't make him revise his view, because his view is absolutely correct. But there's much that he'll be able to add to it when he's read these diaries.
I think certainly for me, the highlight of this first volume was the lead up to the abdication, and particularly a dinner that Chips and his wife held not long before the abdication, where the king and various other members of the royal family and members of the aristocracy went to Belgrave Square for dinner. Does this account shed any new light on what led up to the abdication? Because it's not a period that I'd have to say I know an awful lot about, but it seemed to me that there probably were one or two quite interesting revelations.
Well, what's absolutely clear is that this dinner party you refer to takes place on the 19th of November. It's a Thursday night, and I think it's the previous Monday, the 16th, if I remember rightly, that Baldwin has been to Fort Belvedere to see the king, and the king has said, look, if the choice is abdicating or not marrying Mrs. Simpson, then I'm abdicating. And Baldwin is now trying to talk him out of it. The king comes over that evening as being really relaxed because he's made his mind up. And it's interesting that Chips, at that stage, this is 2 weeks before I think it was the Bishop of Bradford who came out, or the Bishop of Wakefield, who came out and said that the king was behaving badly, and the press silence on this broke. Chips and his friends are all well aware of what's going on. I mean, the extent to which this was known in high society is absolutely clear. And what's interesting about this account that hasn't come out before is the way that it paints a picture of how utterly relaxed the king is and how very on edge Mrs. Simpson is. And it's the last time they go out in London together before she heads for France about a week later, I think. Chips is going to see her about a week later, and it's cancelled because she's having basically a nervous breakdown. And it's at that stage that Perry Brownlow, who is the lord-in-waiting to the king and is a very close friend of Chips, takes her off to the south of France while the final details of the abdication are sorted out. What's most revelatory, I mean, this dinner party is fascinating. Again, it's never been written about before, and there's an awful lot in there that students of the abdication will find interesting. Although I don't think it gives you any new hints about why it happened. I think we all know why it happened, and it just confirms them. But in these appendices, which I've included in the diary, that Chips wrote these memoranda that he wrote in 1937, in January 1937. He's very candid about the people concerned, and quite rude about the new king and queen. He regards George VI as being basically wet, and he regards the Queen Elizabeth, the lady we know as the Queen Mother, as having just been lazy and idle and rather fatuous.
Which is interesting, because earlier on, when 22, 23, he was actually quite close to both of them.
Yes, he was. He rather liked her, and in fact, he thought in 1923, before she married the Duke of York, as George VI then was, that she was going to marry Gage, and that's how, because Gage was his closest friend. That's how he knew her well. And in the later volumes of the diaries, he goes to dinners and parties where she is there, and they are perfectly friendly. But I think when he wrote this thing in January 1937, he was still feeling very wounded at the way that the Duke of Windsor, as he had then become, had been treated. And I think that's because of Chips being an American, and although he has assimilated entirely into English high society, he still doesn't quite get the reason why, in those days, given the King's role as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, it was felt necessary for him to abdicate. It wouldn't be necessary now. We have a future king who's married to a divorcee and is divorced himself. So, I mean, these days things have changed, but things, the past is a foreign country. And if you want to see what a very foreign country it was, these diaries do show that. And I think the tone of Chips's memoranda is where he is angry with the Yorks, is that this fantastically popular and glamorous monarch has been chucked in the bin due to a bunch of old men making decisions about how he could or couldn't conduct his private life. And we've lost this glamour and this excitement. And it's been replaced by a couple of people he finds, frankly, rather common and boring.
I have very, very little recall of those early years of my life. I've had to rely, I've had to rely on photographs that my mother managed to keep and rescue and bring to England when she eventually came. And I've relied on a little book that I found where my fellow pupils at my school sent me lovely messages on my birthdays, and we all swore eternal love. And out of that, and of course what I heard from my mother, I should add that my parents were divorced and I grew up with my mother. Things that she told me, I've tried to reconstruct, but I'm ashamed to say that I really remember far less than some other Kindertransport survivors that I've met who remember things in great, great detail. I don't. So I look back at that period of my life from some distance, but what I do know is it was a complete rupture. I was uprooted, and the things that happened to me at that age of 10 really shaped the rest of my life.
And you got out just in time, really?
Yes, it was 9 months before the war broke out. Yes, I was very lucky.
How often do you think back and think how different your life would have been? I mean, let's assume the Nazis hadn't happened, but I mean, the life that you would have led in Vienna would have been so different from the one that you came to lead in this country as a child and then as an adult. Do you often indulge in the what-if game?
No, I don't really. I think, one has to move on and look to the future. I know that the past is always with me, and as I say, and this is one of the themes in this book, that being a refugee leaves you with certain insecurities for the rest of your life, which you never really completely lose, however successful you are. And I think this has been a common experience. Different people deal with it differently. I know that in my case, it's been quite a struggle.
And I guess that's the reason for the subtitle of the book, A Journalist in Search of Her Life. It's quite an evocative subtitle, that. It could mean a lot of different things.
Well, I had a very inventive help for that title. But I think it is a very accurate description. I've searched for certainties which I've never quite found, hence the description, invisible walls. Trying to break out of some of those problems that I think I've faced. And many people will say this is, when they look at what I've achieved, how can you talk in that way? But I know it, and that's what I've described in this book.
Is it partly because you never found out what happened to your maternal grandmother, because your mother followed you to this country a few months after you came here, and your grandmother was in Prague, and the hope was that she would be able to follow as well, but she never did?
Well, clearly, all Jews, there's hardly a Jewish immigrant family that didn't lose members of their families in the concentration camps. And in a way, I came from a small family, and I was fortunate that in my immediate family, my grandmother was the only one who perished. No, I think it is simply, you were born into a certain culture, and you were torn out of that forcibly. And it is that which colours and shapes your reaction to being a refugee and to how you shape your life. That is the greatest. Of course, the Holocaust is a terrible happening that never you do not forget and you cannot forget. But I think the key personal factor is really simply being uprooted from the background into which you were born. Of course, I go back to Austria quite a lot. I see how people of my mother's generations are mostly no longer there, but people of my generation, how they've shaped their lives. And yes, it's a small world, it's a very different world, but I think what Austria has left me with, and which I've never lost, is the sense of being part of Europe. I mean, I do feel that European is one of my very important identities.
Take us back to the moment you arrived in this country. You came over on a ferry to Harwich, and then took a train to Liverpool Street. I mean, it must have been, and you were on your own. Well, I say you were on your own. There were others with you, but it must have been quite an intimidating experience.
Of course, it must have been. I think I must have been quite a self-confident child, because I settled down very quickly, and again, I have fairly clear memories of the family who looked after me, and who, if my mother had not also managed to come quite soon after I did arrive, who would have taken care of me until at least I reached working age. But and they put me into a local school, a second local secondary school, and I found a school report after the first term where apparently, I'd arrived without a word of English other than the phrase goodbye, which I said to my new foster parents, but I learned English very, very quickly.
Hella pick there. Well, Alan Duncan starts off our next selection. He published his diaries back in the summer. And I have to say, I thought the Daily Mail did him a disservice with the selections that they used for the serialisation of his diaries. It's actually really quite a thoughtful book. Yes, it is quite gossipy. Yes, it can be a bit bitchy, but it tells you a lot about what it's like to be a junior minister in the Foreign Office, and actually shows how you can make a difference in our relations with different countries. So Alan Duncan is the first excerpt that you're going to hear. Then we're going to hear Jonathan Dimbleby talking about his book on Operation Barbarossa in the Second World War. And then a very emotional hour I spent with Kate Garraway talking about her book, about the way that her husband he contracted COVID. Obviously, Derek Draper, who's somebody that I have, shall we say, had a few run-ins over the years. She, I think you will find, is somebody who is one of Britain's heroes at the moment. The documentary that she did to accompany the book, I think, affected a lot of people. And anybody that saw her on Piers Morgan's Life Stories in the last couple of weeks will again maybe want to actually read the full story in the book. Now, one person that you were very unkind about in your book was Emily Thornberry. What did you call her, Alan?
Oh, I can't remember. It was in the heat of the moment.
A graceless frump, I think, was the phrase. And just by coincidence, she happened to be on my programme last night. This is what happened. Emily Thornberry, how offended were you by Alan Duncan's comment?
Water of a duck's back, mate. You should see the feed. My God. Can you imagine? I'm left-wing, I'm female, I'm mouthy, I've got a lot to say, I'm overweight, I won't shut up. Imagine the abuse just imagine. So I've stopped watching The Incoming, and frankly, this is nothing compared to some of the stuff that.
Oh, I now love her, but I think I'd say, what did you say? Something, water, yes.
Water off a duck's back.
So, some back, some duck or something. I don't know. She's lovely. I mean, that was a very nice
Why
reaction.
Why did you describe her in those terms?
Well, I say again, it's in the book. I mean, we were at the Castro funeral of all places. And there is no obligation for the government to provide any kind of services, anything, help for, excuse me, the opposition. But, a long way away and it's a big event. So I bent over backwards to make sure she was met at the airport, was taken to the embassy, was driven to the funeral. And I just felt that at the time...
She didn't say thank you.
Didn't say thank you, and it was as if I was irrelevant and she was the minister. And I just thought, well, blimmin' heck, Anyway, again, water off a duck's back here as well.
Okay.
So never mind.
Looking back on your career in Parliament, because you were first elected in 1992, weren't you? So you've encountered a huge number of memorable characters over the time. When you're in your dotage, which ones are you going to remember most fondly? And because there must have been so many things that happened.
I mean, there are lots. I mean, this has been a bad week, I have to say, for someone who was elected in 92, because two of the most lovely people elected at the same time have both died, Cheryl Gillan and Peter Ainsworth. And I was at university with Peter. I've known him for 45 years. We had many a laugh. I mean, what a caustic wit he had. He was an absolute gem. When you lose friends like that at this stage of life, it's shocking and it's upsetting. To answer your question, obviously the biggest character of all was Margaret Thatcher. Now, I wasn't actually in Parliament at the same time, but
you actually became quite good.
Yeah, I got to know her very well. I quietly used to take her out.
You used to escort her?
Escort her to lunch maybe 3 or 4 times a year with some, one former military person and a diplomat. And one occasion I remember we took her to lunch in the Ritz. And as she got up to leave, the entire dining room burst into applause. And, that's memorable. I mean, Tony Blair, of course, very big figure. I mean, he dominated our politics for 10 years and was, we couldn't really overcome that for quite a long time. William Hague, of course, a very good friend who I take the mickey out of all the time, and more so vice versa. So he was another big figure.
Have I got this right? You do impressions?
Not today, I don't.
Oh,
you have to...
that's very unfortunate. I was looking forward to your William Hague.
I don't know what you mean. He was a big figure. There are some big characters, but Parliament. Am I being an old git in saying that there are fewer big characters? I don't think so. I mean, I think the community of politics in Parliament has diminished. I mean, people don't go and meet each other over dinner. I mean, they come in 9 till 5, everything's timetabled, they vote when they've got to vote, and they push off.
Got a nephew, a nephew-in-law who's a complete tech freak, and he virtually only listens to podcasts. And I went into their house not so long ago, and heard what seemed to be my own voice. And I thought, where's that? And I wasn't certain. I went upstairs, and there he was working away at preparing a meal, listening to the Battle of the Atlantic. And he said, it's fine. I listen to it all the time. I go walking with it. And the only point to make about that is, apart from that, I hope people will do the same, obviously, with Barbarossa, is that people, and they're both, in his case, he's a young guy, an awful lot younger than I am, and maybe somewhat younger than you, Ian. And he likes listening. Now, there are a lot of people like that who use podcasts, and we sell, the BBC sells the idea of the internet, sells the idea of podcasts, knows everything's got to be online, BBC website and all the rest. It's bizarre to me, to go back to where we started, that the long form, as it became called, interview, is no longer.
I don't know if I've ever told you this, but the programme you used to do on a Sunday lunchtime on ITV, Anne Widdecombe always says that was her favourite programme to do, because she said that you had an hour, I think it was just one politician on, and you did have an audience in the studio as well, but she said you got time to explain what you were about, and yes, you did get a hard interview, but that was a good thing. And she said there's been nothing ever since then that she's felt, and I think she was Shadow Home Secretary at the time, and she said that's the best programme she's ever done.
No, she did have the niceness actually to say that to me, and she would be the first herself to confess she's a tough old boot in the best possible way, and she quite relishes, and good politicians, the serious people, the serious politicians, they don't try to avoid things. If they're any good, they will go on, and they will go on when the times are bad as well as when the times are good. I always think of Jack Straw as an example of that, incidentally, from the Labour Party. And they will go on, they will face it if they're given the time. What they don't, the news interview is one thing, isn't it? I mean, could you say that again, Minister, because we've only got 10 seconds and you took 12 seconds. And it's perfectly valid to do that. You're wanting the essence of the quote, just like a newspaper. But I think the intermediate length is very frustrating when you've got the 5 minutes. When you've got enough to be asked a couple of tough questions, but not enough to elaborate an answer which leads to another tough question. And that is a challenging process. That to do it at any greater length. And I do think it. I mean, as having said that, of course, the different kinds of interview. Like Nick Robinson, like yours, Nick Robinson does, are very, very interesting. They're different from that sort of head-on, you are responsible for a policy or you are articulating a case. Now let's test this. And it's our job to test that, not to destruction, but to test it so that it will sustain quite an onslaught. Mm-hmm. After the 2008 meltdown, the way in which the banks had to be stress tested. You should be stress testing ideas and propositions. And mistakes are made because they aren't stress tested. Who's going to do it? It doesn't get stress tested in Parliament. Only by mood and atmosphere. It gets stress tested by the fourth estate, as it used to be called. Yeah.
One thing I've always wanted to ask you, in your years of presenting any questions, did you ever have a guest that was so nervous they were more or less incoherent?
I had guests who was so nervous they got quite drunk. And I knew it, and I think listeners might have detected it. One or two got drunk because they always got drunk, but they never noticed it, therefore. One or two sort of, and I don't want to name any names, were clearly really nervous beforehand. Some of our most formidable figures in politics, and when they came on the programme, one of them is still in the House of Commons, another isn't, is in the Lords. Two come to mind. We have a meet that we used to have, now of course, at the moment, because it's not taking place, we used to have a modest meal before the programme. Yeah. I know somebody only come up. Ken Clark's only coming on for the meal. He was a regular, and he's another character who would always come out. Yeah, I never known him say, maybe he couldn't in practical terms doing it, come out and big beasts do it. Yeah. Kind of the likes of him and Chris Patton and others, that they know you come out, and that's the job of a politician if you're really serious.
Let's go forward to March 2019. Yeah. Sorry, 2020. You describe in the book how you first became aware of COVID in the Good Morning Britain newsroom, and it was something that didn't really hit home until it had become a thing.
I mean, I don't know whether you felt the same, but even before we all started talking about it on air, there were little things, weren't there, drifting through, this terrible virus happening, far away. And I remember thinking, that sounds awful, those poor people, But it wasn't something that you particularly felt people would be waking up in the morning in the middle of the Brexit, shenanigans that we were all trying to kind of piece together and work out. And then I can remember distinctly being on air and seeing a newsfeed say early in the morning saying that Wuhan had locked down and no one was allowed to go out. I can remember saying, what do you mean they can't go out? They can't just make people stay inside. That would never happen here. We'd never do that. It seemed unreal, like a science fiction movie or something. And of course, not only have we had it here, we've done it here, and we've lived with the consequences of something terrible, haven't we, as a nation?
And Derek contracted COVID very early on, I mean, before the end of March. And when did you first realise that it was COVID?
Oh, I mean, literally as I called the ambulance. So he had no cough and no temperature at all, even when he was fighting to breathe. And at that point, the focus was very much on, respiratory failure. Sorry, I can't speak. My lisp is getting in the way. Acute respiratory failure. And so, we were almost actively being discouraged to waste hospitals' time if we didn't have those symptoms, because if you list the symptoms of COVID, it's pretty much anything that could ever happen to anybody. It's huge. It's impossible to know what it is. And it was really when I just thought, you look terrible. You look absolutely terrible. He'd had a bad shoulder and he was sort of complaining about that and, and the painkillers he was on. And it was all kind of muddled over the period of about 2 or 3 days. And then from that, he went into the ambulance and until a couple of weeks ago, never came home again,
And he said to you, as he was put in the ambulance, "You will see me again."
Yeah.
I mean, that must have been
It was terrifying because by then they'd got an oxygen mask on him and was sort of like getting him in as quickly as possible. And he'd quickly hurried the kids inside. And he just said to me, "This isn't the last time you're going to see me, Kate. You will see me again." But even the fact that he'd thought to say that must have been on some level he was worried that it wasn't going to be. I knew that I was thinking that as well. And, for a long time, for many, many, many months, I wondered if it would be. And in a strange way, to be honest, he is very different now. And we don't know what of the Derek Draper that got into the ambulance can be recovered still.
Well, we're going to be speaking to you for the whole hour. Kate's happy to take calls as well, if you'd like.
I am.
She's quite looking forward to it. I think she thinks that
Don't
nobody...
ask me to say acute respiratory failure
She
again.
thinks nobody's going to phone in, but I reassured her that you will.
Ian Dale's Book Club.
The heroes of your book are your children, I think.
Do you?
In that the way you describe how they've coped, I just think... and you obviously didn't want to burden them, if that's the right word, with all of the details. You wanted to keep their hope alive, and that's part of the title of the book. And they come out, I think, as sort of brilliantly adjusted children in this.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think time will tell. I mean, I think in different ways and at different points, they've both obviously been affected. I mean, you couldn't not be affected by it. And they've both coped with it in slightly different ways. But it's a huge thing, I think. And Derek, obviously, he was their dad. I mean, he's a huge presence in their life. And they were very close to him. Darcy particularly, I think... Darcy is kind of like Derek with long hair, mercifully slightly different physical appearance, mercifully for Darcy. Doesn't have the beard yet. And I think, it's very possible for them to feel slightly adrift in a way throughout all of this, as well as heartbroken. So I think but then the other wonderful thing about children is that they do sort of understand, don't they, that the need to sort of grab life and fill life with joy. And I think there's a moment, which I think is in the book, where I was very conflicted when I saw them doing something that I knew Derek would love. There's I think sometimes, grandparents dote and, I don't know, friends can sort of be proud of your kids. But sometimes it's only mum and dad or, the partners that are raising the kids that sort of truly get those stupid little things. And I would see them do something like that I knew Derek would love and instantly feel tragic because he wasn't there to enjoy it.
There's a really good example you give of that when Susanna Reid sent over a box of 2,000 Lego pieces and immediately Billy wanted to start building.
He wanted to build it there and then. And I was thinking, we haven't got time to build 2,000 pieces of Lego. And then I thought, well, hang on a minute. This is your childhood. For me, it's another day where we've got through it and Derek hasn't died. Yeah. But for you, it's another day of your childhood and we've got to do it. And actually, they really helped me because they forced me to, put the phone down, leave it not on silent, leave it so I could hear the phone call if necessary, and just totally get involved in Lego. And I think we were absorbed by the fact that I couldn't follow the rules. And, there's something wonderful about Lego. It's solid, there's rules. If you follow them, things get built. And in a world where there weren't any rules and chaos was all around us, it was a great moment. And they really helped me. You're right. They are the heroes.
I'm just imagining Ben Shepherd listening to this now saying, Kate Garraway not following the rules. Surely not. It's so difficult to squeeze everything that's happened into this. But, I mean, Derek was probably in about the most poorly state that anyone could be in. And literally you were fearing the next phone call. You were fearing what the news would be. Well, I mean, how do you cope with that when day after day you're thinking the worst?
Well, every phone call they prepared you that he might die. They'd say that, you have to realise he might not make this. The phrase they kept on saying was he's hanging by a thread. It's kind of impossible to take that in, really, isn't it? Because what are you meant to do with that information? How do you prepare yourself? And I think what I tried to do was sort of just learn to manage the fear, because I think that's what we've all had to do through the pandemic. And when I first started writing this, of course, I assumed that COVID would be a ghastly period of our lives that we'd be looking back on and we wouldn't want to be reminded of. But now we're at the place where we're hopefully just starting to emerge and think, well, we're all changed and we've all had to learn to live with something fearful and move forward living with something fearful. And that is kind of life a trick that we need to learn for living life anyway, isn't it? I say to friends, the thing is that I now feel like at any minute the world could be snatched from me, but really that could happen any day to any of us.
Kate Garraway there. Well, our next selection starts with the Reverend Richard Coles, who has written a book about grief and particularly his own experience of grief after the death of his partner. It's quite a harrowing read at times, and this was quite an emotional interview. I'd met Richard a couple of times. He invited me to be a guest on his Edinburgh Fringe show a few years ago, and he's a very entertaining character, and a lot of you will know him from his programme on Radio 4 Saturday Live. Then, probably, in retrospect, my most important interview of the year with Sir David Amess. It happened in May. It's all about his book, Eyes and Ears. And we spent an absolutely wonderful hour. And I couldn't bring myself to listen back to it, actually, after he was so brutally killed at the beginning of October. But a lot of people did. And everyone said that he really brought out the best in him. And if you listen to it, you'll understand why he was so beloved, not just by his constituents, but by everybody that he encountered in Parliament. Quite a long excerpt, this. And then I talked to Lord Young of Graffham. You may remember him. He was the man of whom Margaret Thatcher said, David brings me solutions, not problems. And that's quite unusual in the world of politics. So he published a diary of the 1987 election campaign when basically he pinned Norman Tebbit up against a wall. That's one of the anecdotes that you will hear about. And then another big interview with Michel Barnier. I must admit I was quite apprehensive about this interview because I'd been told that his English wasn't that good and he could be a bit prickly, but his English was absolutely fine, and I got on like a house on fire with him, rather surprisingly in many ways. So it's one of the interviews that I really enjoyed this year. When I saw the title of the book, I thought, what a brilliant title. And then I thought to myself, he's missed a trick here. He should have called it Don't Leave Me This Way. Did you ever consider that?
If only you were my editor. It wasn't my original title, actually. My publisher suggested that, and I've learnt now to be a grateful and obedient writer when it comes to my publisher who's just got good judgment about these things.
Well, I should explain, for those who don't know, Richard was a member of the Communards who had the number one hit, Don't Leave Me This Way, in what year was it, 1986?
86, yeah.
I mean, the thing I love about you is that you've done so many different things and had so many different experiences. And when I was listening to you talking to James, talking about your life in London in the 1980s, and I came to London sort of around the same time, a little bit later, and I thought I didn't experience any of that.
But isn't that interesting? You could be, I mean, you and I, same age, same components. But I mean, the political world we would have lived in the early 80s would have been unimaginably distant, I guess. Although proximity in so many... See, when I didn't realise, and this is a terrible thing to admit here, but I didn't think that anyone could be young and gay and on the right. I didn't think that I couldn't understand that. Like, I can remember realising that somebody I knew and liked voted for Margaret. And it was just cognitive dissonance. I just couldn't cope.
Oh, there was a lot of it about, believe me.
I know there was, yeah, of course, happening, but I was too dumb to realise.
But you see, I didn't, how can we put this, act on it until I was 28, so in 1990. So in a way, I don't really live my life by regrets, but I don't particularly regret that, because I think if I had acted on it, I could have been one of the statistics.
Yeah, I mean, I do think anyone who was gay and in London in the 1980s or in New York and Sydney and is still standing is very lucky, because it could easily not have been so. I always wondered, I mean, I don't know, but I wonder if you thought about a political career, in which case you would have a very good reason to keep personal stuff private. Especially, I guess, if you were the Tories then. I mean, I can think might be people I know in public life who were Tories who I think wouldn't have felt able to have been.
Well, in the 1990s, I would have. That's when I should have tried to be an MP. I was sort of. Well, that was when I was in my 30s, and that's really when you want to start it. And I didn't do it, partly for that reason, because I thought, well, I can't do it if I'm not open. I'm not going to have anybody have anything on me. And it was only really in 2002 when I was 40, and I thought, you know what, if I don't do this now, I'm never going to do it. And by that time, it was just that little bit too late in some ways. And I did announce to various selection committees that if they selected me, they would be selecting a gay candidate. And the one that I did stand for in North Norfolk, I mean, you couldn't get a much more conservative area with a small c. I won the ballot with 66% of the vote. And I thought, well, good on you. That to me was a sign that things were changing.
And eventually you say that. I mean, I live in, my MP is Peter Bone, which tells you something about the political of these parts. Very right-wing Tory, conservative in every sense of the word, very big Brexit vote, and yet no one bats an eyelid at same-sex couples. And if you ask, and you get to know someone, you realise there were people being same-sex couples even through the most punitive years of the 1950s. It just wasn't.
Well, my mother's aunt lived with another lady, and in fact, they owned the farm that my parents bought in Ashton, near Saffron Walden. And I'm convinced that they were a couple. And my mother would not hear of it. Don't be so stupid. Of course not. They were just very good friends. And I thought, I don't think so. But they were together, like in the as you say, in the 1950s, and people didn't really care. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about sort of putting people in anonymous groupings rather than thinking about the individuals. And I remember when I confronted the issue of my sexuality with the North Norfolk Conservatives, I was kind of forced into it in a way, because I'd agreed to speak at a fringe event at the Tory Party conference on gay rights, and the chairman rang me up one evening and said, "We've got a bit of a problem. They've got this leaflet with you speaking at this. I think you might need to address it." I said, "That's fine." So I arranged for a question to be asked, because they're not allowed to ask you about your sexuality. And this woman, bless her, got up and said, "Is this a subject that you feel strongly about?" So I had prepared about a sort of 2-minute Bill Clinton tear-jerking speech, which included sentences like, well, you may not think you know anyone that's gay, but your postman might be gay, your dustman might be gay. Believe me, you do. And if you're thinking that being gay would affect my ability to do the job of a Member of Parliament, well, that's what Margaret Thatcher said in 1979, reassuring everyone that being a woman wouldn't affect her ability to be Prime Minister. And I think she was a rather good Prime Minister, don't you? Loads of applause. And at the end of it, I looked up and about a dozen of them were in tears. And I thought, I've got you.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
I mean, I look at the list of previous vicars of Findon, going back to Geoffrey de Toire in 1217.
Great name.
He's good, our Jeff. And I, it's very interesting. If you're a vicar of a historic church, I sit in the chancel sometimes and I watch the sun strike the clear story, and I think somebody just after the Black Death did something very like this. And you get to know a little bit about the texture of your predecessors' lives because they leave a record somewhere or another. And I think I can confidently say that I am not the first gay vicar of Findon.
Well, there's a lot of it about in various religions. I mean, you think the Catholic Church certainly wouldn't exist without gay priests.
And I suspect it was a place where people who were, I mean, they wouldn't have used the word because it wasn't available to them then, but people like me were often drawn to doing things like this.
Mm. Has your flock, your congregation in Findon been a great comfort to you?
Yeah, fantastic. Partly because half of my congregation are widows and widowers because of the demographic of the Church of England, I can put it that way.
Mm.
So they were really great and came, and practical advice is what you want. I remember Mrs. Williams came round with a dish of pannacle tea. She's from the northeast, and
I've no idea what that is.
It's a sort of, one of those kind of northern stews. Like
I'd love that. Yeah.
So she came over with a dish of pannacle tea, which was delicious. She's a very good cook, and I'd been very close to her when she lost her husband, who was a lovely man, and she said, "I'll tell you this. I won't try to do the accent, but I will." And I said, "What?" She said, "Everything you read in them books about grief, it's shite and bollocks." Well, thank you very much. That's what I needed to know. And also, just people really. It's a great community here. It's a classic kind of, it looks like something from the past. It's a, medieval village, 4,500 people. Everyone's got a nickname. Everyone's got a little dog. We've all, everyone knows each other. But it's a really good place. It has its problems like everywhere else, and sometimes you can see the worst of people as well as the best of people. But we take care of each other. And it was really interesting for me, as being someone who my job is literally to take care of people, to all of a sudden be the one being taken care of. David died just before Christmas, and Marion, Mrs. Needle, one of my parishioners, just came around and just gave me a Christmas cake and a Christmas pudding. And kind word. And also, I've buried their parents, I've baptised their kids, I've married them, I've helped educate their grandchildren, and that it's good.
I think at Christmas it's grief is even more intense for obvious reasons. I guess my father died 4 days before Christmas, and my grandmother, in fact, she was the first bereavement that I experienced at the age of 17, and that was just before Christmas as well. And I don't know why it is, but you always get this impression that more people die just before Christmas. I'm sure statistically it's not true, but it is true. It is. Why is that then?
December, January, and September are the two quite marked peaks. I think it's partly because the winter comes and everyone thinks, "Oh bollocks, I'm off," because it's so wretched. I think partly people hold on for things, so sometimes think. But also there is just something. I can't. Another thing, I know how bereaved at Christmas work, because I don't think I've ever done a Christmas since I've been ordained when I haven't anointed someone on the deathbed on either Christmas or Christmas Day, So, actually, you know what it is? It's the winter, everyone comes inside, and there's more active transmission of virus, I suppose.
Yeah, probably. I suppose we're much more aware of that after the last year as well.
Yeah.
Just to finish off, one of the things that made me smile in the book was when you talk about how David would bring you back down to earth and keep your feet on the ground, because my partner is excellent at that as well. And I mean, it must be difficult for other people living with a media tart like you or me.
Especially because this will not surprise you to hear, Ian, and I venture to think you may be the same, is that I don't wilt in a spotlight. I don't scurry to the dark edge of the stage, you know? I'm quite happy with all that. And that's great because it feeds a part of me that keeps me happy, although I have to be careful about that because it's not perhaps a part of me that needs too much nourishment. But it also means that other people have a relationship with me. And they sometimes, they literally push David out of the way sometimes. And he was always, he took it with very good grace. And I always made absolutely certain that he never needed to doubt that that was marginal stuff, and that the centre of my life was him, and always was. And I think he knew that. He was good at the whispering the sort of reality of my clay feet in my ear. He rather enjoyed it, actually, and I could take it from him.
We were joined by the MP for Barrow-in-Furness, Cecil Franks.
Cecil!
And he sat down looking as if he'd got all the woes of the world on his shoulder. And I said, "What's the matter? You don't look very pleased to be here." He said, "Well, I'm not. I never expected to be elected, and now I'm here. And I don't want to be here."
And you see, Ian, we would have this conversation with some of my colleagues. They wouldn't have a clue about it. But you said Cecil looked as if he had the troubles of the world on his shoulders. He did. And it didn't end terribly well, unfortunately, for Cecil, because you never know what's going on. And, of course, you mentioned Mr. Patrick Thompson, who was wonderful. And wasn't it John Powell?
John Powley.
Yeah, who was his...
He was the other MP in Norwich, and who died about a year ago.
Goodness.
I can't explain. Okay, when you visit somewhere like the House of Commons for the first time, you are completely in awe of the place. And then I spent 2 years working there, and it was a totally different atmosphere. Now, it may be just I was young, very young then, was easily impressed. But even now, when I go in there, there's still that sense of sort of wonderment, isn't there?
Oh, it's just 1,000 years old going to Westminster Hall. It's just magnificent. I certainly did not expect to win in 1983. I had many relatives living in Basel, didn't really like it, because being a Londoner, to go from old buildings to everything new was a bit of a shock. I think I was about the 144th seat that could be won, something like that. And I thought we were going to come a good second. I'd rehearsed with everyone how to behave, but hey, Ian, wasn't I lucky? The SDP, they did it for me, and it was the then Sue Slipman.
Oh, she your opponent?
She
I remember her.
Stood for
Wasn't
the
she
SDP.
head of the NUS or something?
She was.
Yeah,
she was,
and also communist, I think.
But Julian Fulbrook, who was a Labour opponent, and his wife, they arrived there. Of course, it was a complete shoo-in, and it was a shock to them. No, I wasn't prepared for it. Ian, I'd only ever been to the House of Commons physically once in my life, in the public gallery, and suddenly I was there. It was without any doubt at all that moment when I was first elected, when there wasn't even a journalist from the local paper that eventually got there covering the whole thing, was for me the greatest personal moment. I'll only ever been known for 1992, where for
we'll come on to
10
that.
Oh, okay. Oh, shut up.
But you, in a way, you were sort of the archetypal Thatcher creation, weren't you? So working class boy, made good, And although we look now and the Tories are getting 48% of the working class vote, that wasn't quite that high at that time, I think. But of course, the sale of council houses, she built this electoral coalition, which for the first time included the so-called C2D2s. I always hate using those expressions. But when you first got into Parliament, was there a bit of imposter syndrome there? You sort of thought, what's the boy from the East End of London doing in a place like this?
Well, one Conservative colleague looked at me and asked me would I pair with him. So he thought I was Labour. I had longish hair then.
You did, yes.
And I feel inadequate and inferior because I was so in awe of the place. I did inwardly, I didn't show, I was worried whether I would be able to cope with it, whether I was good enough, because there were so many colleagues there who were so eloquent. I thought highly intelligent, although, of course, as time wore on, I began to doubt whether they're so highly intelligent, because you can be intelligent, can't you, Ian? But if you haven't got any common sense, then you're struggling a bit. So I did feel inadequate, but then, of course, because there was a big intake, I looked at a number of my colleagues and I thought, well, hang on, you're a bit rough as well. So, I'm in good company.
And there was a lot of competition among the new MPs in that intake on the Conservative benches, because if you are part of a large intake, and I think the 2010 intake was a bit the same, it's very competitive. You want to sort of make sure that the media notice you, that the Prime Minister notices you. And it seemed to me at the time to be a bit of a race between Michael Howard and Edwina Currie as to who was going to be the first from that intake to be made a minister.
Yeah, you see, I wasn't part of any of that because I didn't have connections. I knew one or two MPs, but I didn't have any connections, so I wasn't expecting anything. So this pushiness and trying to shine in front of the media, I wasn't aware of it initially, but my goodness, I was eventually. And you mentioned Edwina, for goodness sake. When I stood up to make my maiden speech, it was packed, following on our side Ted Heath, and I said, Mr. Speaker, it's a great honour for me to address the House for the first time. And she piped up, and about time too. And the whole place went completely silent. And there I was, I had these little postcards which John Major, who was my whip then, had helped me to write. You do 10 minutes, so I had 10 cards, helped me to write. So then it was explained to me that she was very, very ambitious. Michael, who I knew both of them extremely well, obviously, and then it was explained to me that Michael, who was older, was also very ambitious as well. But it wasn't immediately obvious to me because I wasn't part of this group, which of course still exists today, of candidates who expect to win and are working because they're certain to win as far as they're concerned, and then immediately start operating. I'm not going to share with you, Ian, who of the 2019 intake operated like that, but there are some. And because of
I can think of a couple.
I bet of course you can, but I'm not going to share them because they're still colleagues. So, hey, I mean, they both became ministers.
What was your first encounter with Margaret Thatcher?
My first encounter with Margaret was when I was asked to take part in her first party political broadcast as leader. I can't remember if I was chairman of the association then. I mean, this is Newham North West Conservative Association, and I was called to Smith Square to make this broadcast with her. And there was a young lady and a chap called Ted Atwell, who was very famous in Thurrock. He was sort of seen as Alf Garnett, really. And Margaret, well, she had a weakness for all sorts of things, but she did have a weakness for that sort of conservative. So this sort of transit van type affair pulled up in Smith Square, and we all got into it. So we spent the journey from Smith Square to Elstree Film Studios, where we were going to record this party political broadcast.
Well, Margaret Thatcher was in the transit van as well.
She was.
Goodness me.
She was. And that's really when I became to admire her beyond belief, because during the whole of the journey, it's a bit of a journey really from Smith Square to Elstree, was Ted Atwell sat next to her. He never shut up throughout the whole of the journey. And you know, there are some people who keep doing that to get your attention. He was doing that. I thought, well, goodness sake, will you shut up, man? He kept on and on and on. Got to the studio. Margaret was very nice to the young lady who I think was wearing, she wasn't undressed, but she needed a bit of covering up, so she got a cardigan or something for her. We started the programme, and wait for it, there was a cot and a baby in the cot. I don't know how we did it, but there was a ball and chain round the baby's leg, and that was representing the debt of the Labour Party. Well, he couldn't do it. Every time he was asked to do his bit, he just froze completely. We had take after retake after retake. And I thought, this woman, she was so lovely, so down to earth, not like the way some people portrayed her. That was my first encounter. But now thinking about it, I was chairman of the association. We went to her house in Flood Street and we gave her a little basket of flowers, I think from the Primrose League or something. But, oh, my goodness, I think there are a couple of pictures of us looking, well, not as we... Well, Margaret eventually looked fantastic, but there she was in her pinafore dress, and I'm like that, very dour together, and she became this iconic figure much later in life.
Were you disappointed that she never made you a minister?
Nope.
Because you became PPS...
Now, do you believe me, Ian?
I'm not sure I do.
Okay.
I mean, I think there are people who go into Parliament really not caring if they become a minister or not, and I think there are many, many MPs who are quite happy being constituency MPs, but I suspect that once you get there, maybe you sort of see other people and you think, well, actually, I think I'm better than them. Why have they been made a minister? Why haven't I? And you were Michael Portillo's PPS for quite a long time, weren't you?
Well, nearly 10 years.
And, I mean, often when a cabinet minister has a PPS, that normally they will sort of see to it that PPS gets on.
Yeah.
But that didn't happen for you, and I've never understood why.
Well, look, Ian... In your life, you have regrets. We've all got regrets. We've all made mistakes. I've made so many mistakes, misjudging people, trusting people and all that. I really was not driven by ambition. And possibly, as my time spent continued, perhaps I do regret I should have been pushier, really. And I think I was driven because I had this marginal seat.
Yeah.
And I was absolutely focused on the constituency. I know people used to laugh at me. They got fed up with Basildon. We had, I love Basildon stickers.
No, but it worked. That's the thing. Everybody knew about Basildon because of what you used to do.
Now they know about
Southend.
The city. Yeah, so I'm obsessed with things.
There were some great personalities involved in that campaign, weren't there? I mean, within central office as well as household names. And you detail all of the press conferences, which, again, you just don't have anymore in general elections. No. There was a sense of occasion, and you would have serious journalists asking serious questions rather than these incessant gotcha-type questions which we get now.
It is the press conference that Boris holds at number 10. The questions are appalling. We wouldn't have put up with it in our time. No, there was a lot of tension in press conferences in the morning because one wrong word could ruin the whole day's campaigning, and two consecutive wrong words could ruin the whole thing.
And there was one occasion where Margaret Thatcher was asked about private health, wasn't there? And she said, well, I use private health because I want the doctor I want at the time I want in the hospital I want. And I can remember thinking at the time, well, that's a brave one.
yes, that really was. I mean, if this was the very early days of mobile phones, and I kitted everybody out with these great big clunky mobile phones. And then somebody said something wrong, I think it was Margaret again, or somebody, about education and about the difference in public and private. And Ken Baker was the education secretary, and he was out. And I was trying desperately to get a hold of him for 2.5 hours. He had the phone, but he hadn't switched it on.
Ken Clarke is still like that, 40 years on.
Oh, yes, that's right, exactly.
What was he like to work with? Because he was effectively your deputy, wasn't he, when you first came into government?
He was my vicar on earth.
Yes, in the Commons. Yeah.
In the Commons, yes, that's right. It was, well, we got on very well personally. He was very leftish. I was a bit rightish. But we fundamentally believed in the same thing about an enterprise economy. And there's one marvellous occasion I talked into. It was when I became Secretary of State for Employment, and Ken was my Minister of State, and we had one early meeting. We were going through the budget for the department, been going on for 2 days. Eventually, on the second day, it was approaching lunchtime, and the Permanent Secretary thought he could play one of the tricks that they're famous for, and said to me, Secretary of State, you've got a lunch appointment, haven't you? And I said, yes, I have. He said, well, maybe Mr. Clarke will take the last part, which was all about pay rations. And I said, yes, that's a good idea. Let's do that. And I went off, and I know Ken was much more rigorous than I was. I'm a softie in comparison. When I came back, an ashen-faced Permanent Secretary came to me, said, what can we do? He's done this, he's done that.
Because isn't it funny how Ken Clarke has developed this reputation, a bit like Dennis Healey did, as this sort of avuncular figure, sort of everybody's friend. And yet, if you think back to the mid to late 1980s, and indeed his time as Chancellor, he was as tough as old boots.
He was a great Chancellor. He really was, and it's tough.
You think back to the ambulance dispute as well when he was Health Secretary. Yes. I mean, he could not have been more sort of...
Well, he knew what was right, and that was it. It was... Yes, I enjoyed very much working with. In fact, I enjoyed working with my colleagues. Yes, you are right. There was a certain amount of second glances at me. Who's this chap coming swanning in? But that didn't last too long. It had a reoccurrence when somehow the papers quoted her saying that other ministers bring me problems, David brings me solutions, or something like that, which I never heard her say. And I must tell you, the next time I walked into Cabinet, it had just started, you felt the temperature drop. It did not endear me to my colleagues.
But you did have that reputation, and I remember that being said. I mean, I don't think she ever said it in public, did she? But it was reported. But there are time and time again in these diaries, which we should remember cover just over a month, where there was a problem, and you solved it, and you gave her the reassurance that you were going to solve it, and she had implicit trust in you to do that, which she didn't have in many people.
No. Well, you see, I could be tougher than most in a way because I knew I was not long-term in politics. And besides, I'd run the things before, and I ran things afterwards, of course. And I was desperate. We were actually desperate about the result of the election because if we'd have lost, this country would not be this country today. It really wouldn't.
And there were a couple of occasions, which you again mentioned in the book, about there was a little bit of press speculation that you could succeed her, which, being a life peer, would have been incredibly difficult to do. But of course, if that had gained any currency, your political position would have been very difficult.
One day after the election, Alan Clarke took me out to Brooks for dinner. And over coffee, he said, David, we'd like you to follow her. He said, you'd be acceptable on both sides of the party. Meanwhile, alarm bells rang. And he said, we're quite prepared to bring in a private bill and we'll get you a seat and bring you in. I knew that if I did that, I'd be dead in the next week. Not literally dead, but politically dead. Because the great advantage that I presented to her is I could not be a rival.
Yeah.
You know, and aging lions, and towards the end she was an aging lion. You know, she'd been there. I mean, people forget she'd been leader of the party in opposition for 5 years. And at this stage, she'd been Prime Minister for 8, Prime Minister over the Falklands, Prime Minister over the IMF, with all the problems we'd had. And I've never come across, I always had this feeling when I went to see her that somehow she knew more about what was going on in my department than I did, because she read every bit of paper and she had unbelievable work ethic.
Let's turn to your relations with Norman Tebbit, which before I read the book, I had expected there to be a lot more sort of explosions, but you managed it. You managed that relationship in such a way that there weren't really. In fact, the only explosion was on your part at one point.
Yes, yeah, it was on mine.
Well, you grabbed him by the lapels.
You see,
brave man.
The problem wasn't between Norman and I. Norman and I got on very well when I worked for him. The problem was that Tim Bell had worked for Saatchi's and had won the last 2 elections for her. And then he'd fallen out with Saatchi's and set up his own firm. But Saatchi's had the contract with the party. And Saatchi brothers hated Tim. I mean, he was a traitor. And so they would go mad if there was any question of Tim even seeing Margaret. So we had to smuggle her in to Chequers and smuggle. And Norman was very much in the Saatchi thing. Over such silly things, grown men playing games at. I mean, it was silly. And at the point of Wobble Thursday, it is true, we believe there was a poll coming in that showed there were quarters up to 2%. And if we're within 2% a week before the election, that is serious, because that will invigorate everybody else on the other side. And she didn't like this program. She was tired. She had a toothache. And what I thought she needed more than anything else was her confidence. So I was determined, whether Tim's program was better than the other one, I don't know. She thought it was better.
Well, because let's explain that he had created an advertising campaign for the last few days of the campaign. Saatchi's had done a different one. You saw Tim Bell's first, thought that is brilliant, and then saw Saatchi's, thought don't like that at all. And your mission, set by her, I guess, was to persuade Norman to go with the Bell one, and he did in the end.
He did.
But tell us about the altercation.
Well, what had happened is she hated the Saatchi program. So I rang up Tim the day before, and he worked through the night, and they got a program out, boards and I looked at it, and I knew this was going to be the right thing. I showed it to her, and of course she fell in love with it. She thought this was great. So when she came in, I told her about the position. She said, I will not do the Saatchi. I must have Tim Bell. And I said to her very stupidly, all right, Prime Minister, leave it with me. When Tim came in, I said, when Norman came in, I said to Norman, I'll come into this room, I want to show you something. And there on the wall, all the boards of Tim Bell. Oh, he said, who wrote this? I said, Tim. And he said, I'm not having anything to do with it. And then I got him by the lapels, and I said, Norman, if you don't agree to this, we'll lose this.
You can swear on it. It's a podcast. You can swear.
So we'll lose this fucking election. That's right. Yes, we really will, I said. And we'll all lose. And he calmed down a bit at that. I think he was quite startled, because I've never laid my hands on anybody in my life before, or since. Happily, I hope that. And then he agreed and went with it. But it was a very difficult...
but it didn't end there, did it? Because you then had to persuade Saatchi's that they needed to adopt this.
Yeah, well what I did is they would, under no account, would they take Tim's. So I said, OK, copy it.
Because there was another bit of lapel shaking with Maurice Saatchi, wasn't there?
Yes, there was.
You developed a taste for it.
Well, I've lost that taste, but I think...
And he's a big guy.
Yeah, they were a big guy, but you have
Whereas
no idea.
Norman isn't there.
Yeah. They're both...
Norman has the most insipid handshake of anyone that I've ever met, which I was so disappointed at.
Yes. He's had a difficult time.
He certainly has. But where you then find difficulties in the implementation, and clearly there are difficulties, I don't think anybody's denying that, those difficulties need to be resolved. Yes. Are you confident that they will be resolved soon?
I know I'm no longer in charge for the Commission now. The mission is in the hands of a very wise man and very competent man with the Vice President of the Commission, Maros Sefcovic, and he's doing a good work. We are ready to find operational and technical solutions to discuss with the UK, not to renegotiate the protocol. So if it is clear, and in the next few days and weeks, the UK government must be very careful. If it's clear that we work in the framework of the protocol, I think we can be able to find solutions. For instance, for the transport of medicine and some other.
When you say the UK government must be very careful in the next few weeks, what do you mean?
I think that we have to respect this protocol, for the UK government to respect its signature. This situation is followed in each capital, obviously by the Irish people, but also in Washington. So what is at stake is the peace in Ireland. So everybody have to be responsible, and I think that we have to work to implement in a clever way, practical way, without any kind of dramatization or ideology, this protocol. I know that it is. I know the position of the DUP, but I know also the position of the majority of the political party in Northern Ireland, because this protocol is in favour of the economy of Northern Ireland.
Let's move on to your future, because you're standing to be President of France. You hit the headlines in this country recently, as I'm sure you know, when you said that you thought that power should be taken back from the European courts, and also there should be a referendum on immigration into France. Nigel Farage called you a massive hypocrite for that and welcomed you to the Eurosceptic cause. It did seem extraordinary that somebody who's been defending European institutions would then effectively seek to undermine them.
I've been never impressed by Mr. Farage or his polemics and his critics. And never impressed during the negotiation. I'll certainly not be impressed now. Definitively not. So he's wrong, because what I'm speaking about is precisely a new French national policy for migration coming from outside of Europe. I never put into question, as Mr. Farage, the freedom of movement inside Europe. I never put into question the fact that my country is one of the leaders of the Europe from the very beginning. And I want for France to remain and to be strong, and Europe to be strong. So I'm working as a French politician responsible, running for the French presidency, on the problem, which are the problem of France today, with uncontrolled migration policy. And this policy does not work in France. It doesn't work at European level, so we have to change. And Mr. Farage can say what you want to say, and I have nothing to do with him, nothing, never. But I have something to do with the French problem and the French concern to be responsible. And I have no lessons.
But how does a referendum help? I mean, you've seen what happened in our referendum. I mean, what do you even ask in such a referendum?
It's a referendum specifically dedicated to the question of migration.
But what do you ask?
Because there is no reference in the French constitution to migrations. So we have to put some words to be able to take the national measure we need in some cases.
But what is that measure?
The first point is about the capacity for the Parliament to decide every year on quotas for migration, economic migration from outside, abroad. And the second point is to give what we call the constitutional shield to have the capacity to have in our constitution, which is not the case today, the words we need on migration.
Some would say, though, that you're only doing this because you know that to win, you've got to get votes back from Marine Le Pen's far-right party, and that they're obsessed by immigration, and therefore you have to talk about it in this way to get the right-wing vote.
Please, look this morning in the very, very great newspaper, Le Figaro, an article, a tribune signed by Mr. Manuel Valls, the former socialist Prime Minister of France, saying exactly what I said, exactly the same. So I don't care on Mrs. Le Pen or the others. I care about the problem and the fact which does not work in my country, and to find solution. I'm European, I'm patriot, and I have no lesson to receive, neither from the patriotism, neither from the European involvement. But the difference with many others is precisely the Brexit. I want to draw the lessons. We have to tackle, to answer to the concern of the people in the right way.
You voted for Emmanuel Macron last time. If you win the nomination,
the second term,
second
against
ballot,
the extreme right.
If you win the nomination, you will be fighting him now. You've been quite critical of him recently. What did you think of his reaction to the creation of the AUKUS pact between Britain, America and Australia?
This decision to cancel this contract on submarine is very serious. On the substance itself, obviously, but also and perhaps more seriously about the method and the fact that the behavior between allies was not correct. This contract has been cancelled without any prior discussion between allies, between the United States of America, Australia, UK, and France, and it was not fair. And I think it's not the good behavior, not the right behavior to have between allies. If alliance means trust and not allegiance, I'm not ready to accept an alliance which would mean allegiance. It's not the interest of NATO to have a weak leg in Europe. So, once again, I think it was not the right behavior, and now the problem is serious, and the French are unanimous on this point. The US and the UK have a lot of effort to do to rebuild the trust, because this trust is seriously fragilized.
If you become president, how will the relationship between France and the United Kingdom be different from if Emmanuel Macron wins again?
I'm not looking to create a difference everywhere. When the French attitude is correct, when the French decisions are correct, I will support and continue or amplify. We could have the same feeling about the fact that the situation today is very, very serious, and it's not good for both sides. So we need to rebuild the trust between allies after the AUKUS crisis. We need trust to be sure that the signature of UK will be respected, and the Brexit treaty for Ireland and for the fishery. This is the precondition for us to rebuild the cordial entente.
Michel Barnier there. Our final selection of 3 interviews are absolute corkers. The first one with Fee Glover and Jane Garvey, the stars of the Fortunately podcast. You'll know them from their programmes on Radio 5 Live and Radio 4. Obviously, Jane Garvey recently stood down as a presenter of Woman's Hour, and Fee Glover, she presents The Listening Project. But they were talking about their new book, which I have to say is very, very entertaining. It's meant to accompany the Fortunately podcast. It's not sort of the podcast. And it's called Did I Really Say That Out Loud? They are two of my favourite people in the world of radio. They're very funny, and you'll certainly enjoy this. In fact, I think it's the longest excerpt in this whole collage of interviews that I've done over the past year. That's followed by Peter and Steph Shilton. Now, they've written a joint book about Peter's addiction to gambling and how Steph managed to get him off gambling. Again, quite emotional at times. And we round the podcast off with 15 minutes with Giles Brandreth. I was tempted to put the whole podcast on this because he is just so entertaining. He's one of those people that you interview, and as an interviewer, you don't really need to do much. You just sit there, listen, and enjoy. So I hope that's what you've been able to do over the last, hour and a half, 2 hours. And do enjoy Giles Brandreth.
So Chuff came about because Jane did one of her wonderful ramblings on things in the domestic arena, and she was wondering out loud on the podcast what those tiny bits of kind of grit are in your cutlery drawer. You know, if you leave it uncleaned for too long.
Because Ian doesn't do any housework.
Does he not? No,
she knows that from my podcast.
Okay, so you will know Chuff very well.
Yeah.
So those bits of grit that just accumulate and you have no idea how they got there or what they are. So Jane said, what are they? And so the phrase cutlery chuff was born.
I think it was actually your phrase, wasn't it?
Well, I just said chuff.
It's a good word, isn't it?
Yes.
Arrived,
It's underused.
I mean, chuffing is a swear word, isn't it?
Yes, and I think
hell.
chuff's quite rude in some parts of the world, but we didn't know that.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think it means a bottom.
Does it?
Yes.
I think it means a lady's bottom, to be precise.
Front bottom.
Do you know what? Jane always has to turn it into a women's thing.
It's always gynecology with me.
That's what 13 years does for you. Now, it's an interesting idea to do a book of a podcast. It's sort of normally the other way around, isn't it?
Gosh, is it? Well, I suppose, is it?
Well, do you mean audiobooks?
Well, no, I can't think of another podcast where someone's done a book based on their podcast.
Oh, I thought we were...
I think you're being innovative.
Very unusual for us to be at the start of something.
It is, isn't it? Gosh, I mean, I feel uncomfortable at the frontier.
Well, pioneering. That's what we are.
Yeah. Well, I guess so. I suppose we did... When we were asked to write a book, it was because the publishers wanted to try...
So you were asked rather than you suggested.
Than flogged.
Oh, we're terribly posh. We were asked.
Yes, we were asked.
Get you.
Yes, I know.
Very lucrative then.
It's not for us to say.
It's not bad, actually. We should say that, shouldn't we?
Yeah, we should own it.
Yeah, we should own it, sister.
Yeah. Are you listening at the BBC? No, they won't be.
Yes, I note that you haven't promoted the book on the podcast at all.
We can't, for contractual,
not even mention.
For contractual reasons. It's a book based on a podcast, but it's not directly lifting the podcast, is it? Is it, Ian?
No,
Back
definitely not.
Here.
No.
But the book tries to capture what's in the podcast, which is us having a conversation. So the whole shtick of the book is that one of us writes a chapter and then the other one immediately responded to it. So hopefully you get a bit of what the podcast is about, which is two midlife women talking in the way that two midlife women talk.
Because I played a little game with myself halfway through the book. I thought, I'm not going to look and see who's written the chapter and who's responding. I'm going to try and guess. And every single time I got it wrong.
Really?
Which, given that I know you both a bit, rather surprised me. But do you think that's a good thing that I wasn't able to tell?
Well, it's not. It's a completely contrary to what other people have just have told me, which is, I can always hear I can hear Fee's voice.
Well, there are one or two where you actually use each other's names, so that's a bit of a giveaway.
Yeah,
but most of the time, I was wrong.
That's interesting.
That is interesting.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Sorry. Well, we don't necessarily think alike. I know. I mean, it's sort of a joke that BBC management can't always tell us apart, but it has an unfortunate kernel of truth at the very heart of it, doesn't it? We're both small, both got brown hair, we're both ladies, and we're both broadcasters, so more or less indistinguishable from each other, really. And I think genuinely, I don't know whether it was Fee they originally wanted to give the woman's hour job to, and they just ended up with me. It wouldn't surprise me.
I think there have been some times. I mean, there was quite a. We laugh about it, don't we? I'm not sure the protagonist involved laughs about it, but there was an event at the Royal Albert Hall that Jane was invited to where she had to spend the whole evening answering questions that were clearly about me before in the interval. She had the gumption, of which Garvey has a lot of to say.
No, I took a lot of gumption to say.
I'm not Fee.
I'm Jane.
Do you find that funny or insulting?
think at the time I was a bit hacked off, not because I mind remotely being mistaken for Fee, but you do think they ought to know which one I am, really. It was a hot night. Listen, it was a very hot night. It was the summer of 2012. I remember it was the build-up to the Olympics. I think we were all a bit overexcited.
Yes, possibly.
We'll let it go. I mean, we've let it go. It's only 10 years and I'm still 11 years I'm still talking about it. It's all gone. Don't worry about it.
Fortunately, it's undergone a few incarnations in its time. It started off very different to how it is now. Where did the idea come from?
Well, I mean, it wasn't how it is now on paper anywhere at any time. I mean, it wasn't, the normal process would be a commissioning editor or a producer comes along and says, would you like to try out, on doing this programme? It is this structure and this format and whatever. And it was never that. I mean, the BBC was entering the podcast world. It wanted to try out some things. Jane and I went along and sat in a room and shot the breeze together in a pilot that was then described as, one of the people in charge of commissioning it was aghast at the content, so that didn't go anywhere. And aghast, I think, was the word. It was quite rubbish, wasn't it?
It was terrible.
Terrible, yeah. But then they persevered, and it started off it was meant to be a radio review podcast, which I think I enjoyed that more than you did.
Yeah, I just found the structure. I mean, I think what's so liberating about doing any kind of podcast, is why you enjoy doing podcasts so much, is that you can just have something much more akin to a proper conversation with someone. And we've both done these very traditional, very hyper-structured BBC magazine shows, which, I mean, they're wonderful to do in terms of getting an audience. And I know a lot of members of the public love these shows and have grown up with them and think they're all wonderful. But it can be really difficult to do it well, can't it?
I think after a long time, that's the problem, isn't it? I mean, Jane was on Woman's Hour for 267 years. And I think probably after the 31st, no, you were there for 13 years. And I think it is, the formula becomes ingrained in you, doesn't it? And, I think you've enjoyed enormously just being able to shoot the breeze. And she's so funny, Ian. I mean, off the page, properly laugh out loud funny. And I don't think Woman's Hour, for all the right reasons, you couldn't do that on Woman's Hour.
I remember. Well, I did try. I tried. I mean,
but you did on 5 Live.
Yes. Well, I was working with someone. You just talked to Peter on your All Talk podcast, and obviously I listened to that, not least because he was very nice about me, actually.
Yes, he was, wasn't he? I was surprisingly nice, I thought.
Yeah, well, we used to have he was right. He did acknowledge that we fell out, and we did fall out, because we really used to wind each other up. But at the heart of that, at the heart of this, actually, is a genuine friendship. And I don't think you can't make that. You can't ape that. You either have a friendship with someone or you don't, like you and Jackie Smith, for example. But I did try to inject humour into Woman's Hour. I remember saying once, we've got this incredible Woman's Hour archive, which they have. They've got this extraordinary archive of amazing interviews with women going back over 70 years. But I said, we've got some amazing archive. I mean, you can actually, if you go back far enough, you can hear Jenny Murray interviewing Boadicea. I mean, it's slightly crackly, but you can hear it. And I remember the editor taking me aside after the programme and saying, can you stop doing that sort of thing? And of course,
well, you actually got the editor said, no, we don't want any of that lot.
They just had absolutely no. It wasn't that she wasn't even a woman without a sense of humour. She was just a woman who was used to a particular style of broadcasting. And, Jenny did Woman's Hour for over 30 years. I mean, even when I left, I was still getting people saying, who? Where, is Jenny off today? And you think, oh, bloody hell, 13 years I've been here. And still, I was just the one who wasn't Jenny Murray. And, that's great credit to Jenny, who was, a sort of, an overarching figure in the whole business, which I emphatically wasn't. But I mean, Fee did other programs. So you did Saturday Live, didn't you? Which was what is that sort of light-hearted Radio 4 magazine show? It comes, the department that makes it is called Factual Entertainment. Factual. It doesn't get any more fictional BBC entertainment than that. It's factual entertainment. Yes. And actually that, to give it its due, that was a very good attempt by the BBC to embrace something a little bit more kind of laid back and I suppose emotional, actually, in that slot. So we took over Saturday Live after John Peel had died,
And Home Truths had done the same thing, where it had just taken the domestic and respected it, and people had loved it for it. So yeah, Saturday Live was a little bit looser around the edges.
That's quite a hard act to follow, isn't it, John Peel?
Well, yes, it was, and I think all of us were very overawed by that was a very long shadow, and rightly so. I mean, he was just brilliant at it, and our main aim with the programme when we launched it was to just get it to the place where people didn't call it Home Truths or say it's the show that used to be Home Truths. That's all we wanted to be able to do, was just create a new identity in the slot. So, and I think we did do it after a while, not immediately. We didn't get it right, from the get-go. But yeah, that was a bit loose around the edges. But I think, fortunately, has really allowed... The BBC have been really good about it. I mean, for all our cynical japery about our current employer, Jane.
One of our current
employers. I think both of us have been really thrilled that the BBC has let us be as kind of freewheeling as we are on a podcast.
And how does it work now? It's also on air on Radio 4 as well, an abbreviated version.
To be honest, do you ever think about that?
No, I've never. I heard it once on the radio. It must have been a night when LBC wasn't up to scratch. I don't know what it was, but anyway,
obviously I was off.
You must have been off. No, it goes on at 11 o'clock. It goes on Radio 4 at 11 o'clock.
It's Tom Swarbrick.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah. I got the shock of my life, and I thought, my God, what's this doing? Oh my God, turned it off immediately, because it felt almost intrusive, and this is really psychologically, I don't know what you'd make of this, but I felt it was all wrong to hear it on the radio. It is a podcast, and there's an intimacy about the podcast.
When it was announced, I thought that's going to kill it, because if they're constantly thinking, I better not say this.
We never do. We never do. No. And because we'd never had that ambition for it, so it's lovely if the BBC wants to cut it down and put it on air in, what I think you'd consider to be a prime slot there, Ian.
It's a big one. It's the one they all wanted.
When you switched from 5 Live to Radio 4, was it about the same time? I can't remember.
No, so I went first. So I think I joined Radio 4 to do Broadcasting House in... My memory's not great, Ian, so help me out with this. Maybe somewhere around 2005.
It was a long time ago.
2004.
I can remember doing that when Eddie Mayer was doing it, but I don't think I ever did it when maybe you banned me.
So no, that would never have been the case. I love working with you. You know that, because we used to do Sunday service
we
together.
Might come on to that.
Yeah. So I think I went in 2004. I only know that I was there before Jane, because I once had to go on feedback to defend her arrival on the station. And they phoned up and they basically said, everyone hated you when you first came to Radio 4, so would you like to come on feedback and tell the audience why they shouldn't hate your colleague? So it was... I was happy to do that as well.
And when did you go, Jane?
2007. Honestly, they had to close the Woman's Hour message board because I was getting so much abuse.
So you had replaced Sue McGregor?
No, I had actually replaced... Well, Jenny wasn't very well at the time, so and there were 2 presenters doing the programme, Ritula Shah and a woman called Jane Little. Ritula, by the way, I think is an amazing broadcaster. She's so good. And it was handled in time-honoured fashion by neither Jane nor Ritula being told that I was coming until they looked on BBC Gateway, and there was my mug with the big Garvey to Woman's Hour. So I think they were both...
Why is it that radio stations
can't communicate? I don't know.
I remember when I took over from James Whale, I had to tell him myself.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
And it happened another time as well.
That's not great.
It really isn't.
HR, is it?
No, it isn't brilliant.
I don't think I've ever spoken to anyone in HR in 30 years at the BBC. Have you? Yeah, actually, you're probably in most weeks, aren't you?
But when you went to Radio 4, was there part of you thinking, I'm going to have to watch my P's and Q's now, and that the sort of spontaneous humour that you could do on 5 Live, it doesn't work on Radio 4, does it?
Well, I tried. I think I had to. There's some ridiculous press release that came out when I went to Woman's Hour, and they trotted out some line. I'm thrilled beyond measure to be joining Radio 4, which, frankly, I wasn't. Because I was never a Radio 4 listener, and although I listen to some programmes on it now, I do not believe, as some people I believe at Radio 4 believe, that it is the single greatest radio station on planet Earth. I think it has some superb broadcasters and some great programmes, but I think there are loads of other BBC stations and stations like this that offer just as much to the discerning radio listener. And I'm a radio fanatic, I just love radio. And
well, that's something we all have in common.
Yeah, no, we are all three of us are a bit
about it.
tragic in that respect. What do you think? I think